with the Littman Library in Jewish Civilization, which goes back many decades. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Connie Weber, who is both a member of the advisory board of the Institute for Polish Jewish Studies and also managing editor of Polin Studies in Polish Jewry. Managing editor sounds very technical, sounds a bit in the background, and this is what I think Connie likes to be. If I don't want to say anything what you don't like, but a managing editor is somebody who's not in the front line, so to speak. But that said, obviously, Connie's contribution to the extremely successful program of the Littman Library of Jewish Civilization, and more particularly to the success of Polin Studies in Polish Jewry, cannot be overstated. She's a very careful editor, a very productive editor, one who seeks negotiations with us chairs of the editorial board, and has always the best of the publication and of the authors on her mind. Obviously, also what the publisher does with it, and nobody's in a better position to reflect on the published side of Antony Polonsky's research, which is so wide-reaching. And it is therefore a great pleasure for me to invite Connie to the floor to speak about these decades of cooperation. Please. Unmute yourself, please, Connie, and the floor is yours.
Oh, hello, everybody. Let me start my presentation by thanking you, Francois, for giving me this opportunity to pay tribute to Antony publicly. It's a very great honor, and I'm really very grateful to you. I shall focus on Antony's connection with the Littman Library as publisher of the Polin series that I'm sure you all know, as well as publishers of Antony's 3-volume monograph on the history of the Jews in Poland. Now, I've been the managing editor of Littman for some 32 years, and Antony's connection with Littman goes back almost 30 years to 1992. So we have indeed been working together for a very long time, and there's a lot to say. So although the main focus of my tribute will be Antony, obviously, I'd like to start with a few words of background about the history of how Littman came to publish Polin. Now, Polin is published under the auspices of the Institute for Polish Jewish Studies and the American Association for Polish Jewish Studies. The Institute was the umbrella framework that Antony originally set up for the landmark first international conference on Polish Jewish studies that he organized in Oxford in 1984. At this point, it's difficult to remember that this was actually a first conference on the subject, but it was very visionary. Part of his vision in organizing the conference, and Antony is certainly a man of great vision, was to initiate an annual English language scholarly journal to publish new research on the subject. That was Polin, and that was something that had not been done before, and it was a truly momentous step. He took the idea to Blackwell's, an Oxford publisher fast becoming known for its journals on contemporary topics. He didn't even consider Littman. Littman was then tied into Oxford University Press, and accepting new projects was a slow business. Another very major factor at the time was that Louis Littman, who had established the Littman Library in 1965 and was still at its helm at this time, was in and out of hospital with leukemia. So it wasn't appropriate to suggest major new projects. This was, of course, all before my own involvement with Littman. So although Polin is now identified with Littman, it was originally published by Blackwell's. Most people have probably forgotten that. They've also probably forgotten that the first volume, which appeared in 1986 in hardback only, cost a whopping £55, which at today's prices would be £138. That very high price reflected Blackwell's view of Polin as an annual that would be bought principally by libraries, as indeed many journals are. Now, despite the high price, the publication was in fact very well received, with scholarly praise pouring in from all sides. Polin was a success. And Blackwell's decided that they could undoubtedly increase their income by publishing 3 issues a year. That's how commercial journal publishing operates. But but in this case, it couldn't work. Antony was unable to supply sufficient material to match that pace. He was essentially working on his own with no permanent staff. And although he had great plans for the future of Polin, producing 3 issues a year was not part of his vision, not something he could do. So he had a problem. Antony set about solving the problem with his usual optimism and creativity. His first move was to ask whether the Littman Library, now newly independent from Oxford University Press and able to explore new ventures, might be willing to take on the series. The timing was fortuitous. Louis Littman, who had founded the library, had meanwhile died, and his widow Colette was fiercely determined to continue the publishing venture that her husband had started. Even so, the Littman trustees were dubious about the scale of the commitment. A volume a year for a foreseeable future, and indeed beyond, this was quite a daunting undertaking. So finance was a potential sticking point, but as we all know, Antony excels at finding creative solutions to difficult problems. He also knows how to use his vast web of contacts. In this case, given that his Institute for Polish Jewish Studies was notionally based in Oxford, he approached the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies and offered to make his institute an associate center. Now, this was an astute move, and it achieved 2 goals. It added to Polin's kudos by giving it a very respectable Oxford academic connection, and it added to the Oxford Centre's kudos by expanding its publishing activity and increasing its visibility. Visibility is always good for fundraising. Every institution needs money, so this was in the Centre's interest. So in achieving 2 such objectives, it was a totally remarkable proposal, but it did not directly solve the financial problem of a subsidy for Littman. We were still back, or he was still back at square one. That was Antony's next step. Once again, his political skills came to the fore, and not only, again, his political skills, but his ability to make connections with people. With his ear ever to the ground and aware of all relevant developments, he knew that the chair of the Oxford Centre's Publications Committee was just embarking on his own research projects in Poland. This was one Jonathan Weber, now of course my husband, but that's a different story. Antony, ever the optimist, thought that somehow Jonathan might be able to help because he had secured major public funding for his different projects in Poland and was in that sense heavily invested in the subject. And Antony's initiative paid off. Understanding the importance of Polin, Jonathan persuaded the trustees of a small family trust to come up with some seed money to solve the problem. They agreed because the family's origins were in Poland, and it seemed right to honor those origins in this way. The subsidy was small and only for 3 years, but it was sufficient to encourage Colette Littman and her son Robbie to commit to publishing Polin, initially on a trial basis for 3 years from 1994, starting with volume 8. Littman understood Polin's potential to open up a new field of scholarship. Our very first step was to reduce the price of Polin from £55 to £37.50 to make it more accessible to individual purchasers. Each volume was to have a theme reflected in the title. Under Blackwell's, Volumes were identified merely by number. Volume 8, the first to be published by Littman, was Jews in Independent Poland, 1918 to 1939, a very clear statement of the subject. We felt that having a title would help give readers an insight into what was on offer and would increase sales as individuals could immediately see the relevance of each volume to their own work. We also introduced a picture on the jacket to reinforce the theme, because previously the early pull-ins had all looked the same. A fourth innovation was an index. The pull-ins published by Blackwell's did not have indexes. Now we take these changes for granted, but they were major at the time, and with these changes, pull-ins soon began to attract a new following. Its success was such that 2 years later, with volume 10, another major change was introduced: the decision to publish a paperback edition simultaneously with the hardback at a price of £19.50. The objective here, once again, was to make pull-in and the scholarship in pull-in more accessible to individuals, especially junior academics, postgrads, and even a readership in pull-in itself. Within 4 years, thanks to Littman being a registered charity and willing to absorb the full costs of publishing pull-in, the price of the publication had been cut by almost a third relative to what Blackwell's charged. As Antony remarked in the preface to volume 10, these changes were a sign of confidence in the growing interest in the area, particularly among the new generation and of the changes taking place in Polish-Jewish relations. He continued, quote, "This is clear too from the text of the lecture given by Krzysztof Śliwiński, Polish ambassador to the Jewish diaspora, under the auspices of the Institute for Polish Jewish Studies, which is reproduced in this volume," unquote. Yes, by this time, Poland had appointed an ambassador to the Jewish diaspora, a totally new departure, and at the Polish embassy in London, he had addressed the Institute at the launch of volume 9 of Pull-in, the first volume to be launched at the embassy. Holding an annual one-day conference at the Polish embassy in London to launch each new volume of Pull-in became an established tradition, which continued without interruption until the pandemic. Today's conference, in fact, builds on that tradition, which is very satisfying for those of us involved in organizing those early conferences. Volume 11, I believe, marked another major milestone: the creation of an American Association for Polish Studies, which has been instrumental in raising money to fund the costs incurred in putting Pull-in together before it even reaches Littman, especially the cost of translation. Pull-in undertakes to translate material from Polish, from Russian, Ukrainian, and Hebrew, and the American Association has helped do that and helped also raise the profile of the subject in many ways with its outreach programs. Let me now briefly enumerate what Antony has achieved with Pull-in in terms of numbers and statistics. Volume 33, as Francois said, Jewish Religious Life in Poland, was published this past January. Volume 34, Jewish Self-Government in Eastern Europe, is in production and will be published next January. Volume 35, Promised Lands, Jews, Poland, and the Land of Israel, is currently being edited. Volumes 36, 37, 38 are in preparation, and probably a volume 42 that I don't even know about yet. All that is simply amazing. One volume a year of some 500 pages, year in and year out. And the fact that each volume has a theme really does help build up a credible picture of the astonishing breadth and richness of Polish Jewish history. Once again, the credit here is entirely Antony's. He comes up with the themes and then identifies for each theme the editors who will be capable of bringing together contributors from around the world who together can create such a volume. And all this happens each year like clockwork. Let me also point out that all the Polins are still in print. I have to do an advert here, and available from the Liverpool University Press website. And you can take advantage of the 30% discount we have offered for this conference to buy them all. When I finish speaking, I believe you'll be able to see a PowerPoint presentation of the covers of all the volumes of Polin to date, and of Antony's own 3-volume history of the Jews of Poland and Russia, an astounding, monumental credit to what Antony has achieved. Even if we consider only the 33 volumes already published, that's something like 17,000 pages of scholarship. Even by volume 12, Polin had clocked up contributions from 300 different scholars. I know that because in the year 2000, we published an index to volumes 1 to 12, edited by Antony, of course. Announced as a, quote, vital tool for research in any area of Polish Jewish studies, it included a table of contents by volume, a chronological table of contents, an index of persons, more than 4,500 people, an index of subjects, more than 6,000 detailed entries, an index of books reviewed, an index of contributors, that's how I know there were more than 300, notes on contributors, a chronological table of Polish history, and 10 maps. Unfortunately, it never sold well. It was visionary, but it didn't sell. But I commend it to all of you. Even on its own, it's a fair indication of Antony's thoroughness, dedication, creativity, and organizational ability. I'm not going to give you any more statistics. Probably all of you participating today have at some time published an article in Polin or read an article in Polin and know at first hand, far better than I do, the impact that Polin has had on the field of Polish Jewish studies. And in saying Polin, I'm using the term as a shorthand way of referring to the impact that Antony has had in the field through Polin and through his own 3-volume History of the Jews in Poland and Russia, now also available in public, and through his paperback, and through his 1-volume abridged version, A Short History, also published in paperback, which itself runs to 650 pages. And on top of that, there is Antony's immense contribution to the Polin Museum, although of course that is entirely behind.
Sorry, Connie, we've lost your, yep, there you are.
Yes, I'm back again. On top, I don't know how that happened. Anyway, on top of all of that, there's Antony's immense contribution to the Polin Museum, although of course that is entirely beyond the scope of the Polin yearbook published by Littman. By now, I hope I've given you a reasonable picture of what Antony has achieved, but I've barely scratched the surface in paying tribute to him in a more personal way. The problem I found myself facing is that I'm not a historian, I'm not even an academic, and I have no formal training in the field of Polish Jewish studies. How then was I going to prepare a tribute to Antony? So I did what I do the whole time in my role as managing editor. I sought out the advice of experts. Fortunately, Littman authors and friends of Littman were very generous in helping me, and it is with great pleasure that I will share some of their thoughts with you now. I want to start this off by setting the scene. For some 15 minutes now, I've been talking about Polish Jewish studies as an area of academic research. All of us here, and I understand that some 350 people have registered with this event, have come to take it for granted that the field exists, forgetting that we owe this largely to Antony and to Polin. When Antony launched Polin, Poland was still a communist country. A movement between Poland and the rest of the world was not so easy. In sending me her thoughts, Natalia Alexion recalls that period vividly. Now herself a professor at Touro College in New York, and author of a forthcoming volume, which we will be publishing on conscious history, Polish Jewish historians before the Holocaust, she was then a graduate student at Warsaw University. She writes as follows, quote, I first met Professor Polonsky in the early 1990s in Warsaw. He came as a guest to the seminar taught my advisor, Professor Jerzy Tomaszewski. We were just a small group of students. We gathered in a seminar room on the upper floor of the Institute of History and waited to meet this foreign historian. We belonged to a cohort that went through the university without international student exchanges or study trips abroad. Frankly, I didn't quite know what to expect. I remember we talked briefly about Professor Polonsky's interest in the history of interwar Poland. He insisted on speaking in Polish, elegant and really flawless, until he mentioned Lodz, and then he corrected himself, explaining that the inhabitants of the city would pronounce its name differently depending on who they were. For me, an MA student interested in the history of Polish Jews, this was a new and totally fascinating point, one that has stayed with me as one of seemingly mundane but really transformative educational moments, unquote. So that's where Antony started having a transformative effect. She added in a second message that she remembered how very elegantly dressed Antony was that day. Much has changed, but not that. Let me continue with some other tributes I've received from our authors. I shall mention them in alphabetical order. So the next one is from Professor Richard Cohen, who actually holds a chair in French history at the Hebrew University. But I included him because I respect his broad knowledge of Jewish history and because he's publishing a book with us on the Polish Jewish artist Samuel Hirschenberg. Richie did not disappoint. On the contrary, quote, even one who, like myself, has spent his scholarly life afar from Polish history stands in awe at what Antony Polonsky has achieved. Where else would one go to give a lecture in a general course on modern Jewish history than to his monumental 3-volume history of the Jews in Poland? And if one wants to know something about the contours of Jews in Łódź, Krakow, Warsaw, and beyond, where would one turn? To Polin, of course. His work has enabled a wonderful network of scholars in various countries to emerge and find colleagues pursuing a range of issues and problems, and to allow them to profit from each other's scholarship, and more important, to disagree with one another, unquote. Next up, as the contemporary idiom has it, was Professor Barbara Kirschenbach-Gimblett, the chief curator of the permanent exhibition at the Polin Museum. Barbara isn't actually a Littman author, but how could I pay proper tribute to Antony without asking Barbara to say a few words? She responded immediately, as she always does, quote, Antony Polonsky is unparalleled among historians today as someone who has tackled the long and complex history of Jews in Poland and Russia. His magisterial 3-volume work on the subject is a landmark. But beyond what he himself has written, with a command of the requisite languages and an astonishing breadth of knowledge that extends beyond history proper to encompass literature and more, he has been instrumental in building the entire field. This can be seen in the intellectual leadership and expert editorial skill evidenced in the Polin series and the conferences that launch each new volume. Scholars, both junior and senior, are the benefits of his generosity, collegiality, and collaborative spirit, unquote. Antony, I hope you're listening. Let me emphasize 3 of Barbara's main points. Antony's contribution to Polish Jewish history is unparalleled. He has an astonishing breadth of knowledge that extends beyond history proper to encompass literature and more. And scholars, both junior and senior, are the benefits of his generosity, collegiality, and collaborative spirit. The next tribute comes from Professor Shulamit Magnus, author of A Woman's Life, Pauline Wengeroff and Memoirs of a Grandmother, which we published some years ago. She describes Antony as, quote, a giant in the field of Polish-Jewish history in our day, and she continues, quote, the gargantuan work he invested as editor of Polin alone was pivotal in bringing hundreds of studies to light in dozens of volumes that have revised and defined the field, while encouraging new scholars and promoting innovative scholarship in such areas as the history of women and the family. His own multi-volume, The Jews in Poland and Russia, has given scholars and lay people a definitive, engagingly written book that takes its place among the work of Simon Dibnov, Selo Baron, and others, incorporating much new scholarship and methodological innovations. In a field marked in the past by language delineations and disputes, Antony has done much to bring English into that fold and an English reading public into sophisticated, nuanced discourse about Polish-Jewish history. Not least is his role with others in framing the meaning and direction of the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews with the profound historical knowledge and perspective that he carries. As someone who has also experienced Antony's hand as an editor, his unfailing consideration has made working with him
Connie, you are on mute.
goodness. Thank you. Let me again pick out some key points. Antony is a giant in the field of Polish-Jewish history in our day. He has revised and defined the field, promoting innovative scholarship in such areas as the history of women and the family. His own multi-volume Jews in Poland and Russia has given scholars and lay people a definitive, engagingly written textbook that incorporates much new scholarship and methodological innovations, bringing an English reading public into sophisticated, nuanced discourse about Polish-Jewish history. Like the others I have quoted, Shulamit comments that thanks to his unfailing consideration, working with him is a pleasure and a privilege. I should say, by way of perhaps of an apology, I did ask people to give me their tributes in 100 to 120 words. One of the problems of an editor is dealing with texts that are too long, but I felt these were really worth having, so I've retained everything that people said. Professor Moshe Rossman's appreciation of Antony is succinct. Moshe has published 3 books with Littman, and we are currently working on his magnum opus, Categorically Jewish, Distinctly Polish. Here's what he had to say, quote, Antony is the adult in the room in our field. I really like that. Antony is the adult in the room in our field, always ready to entertain fresh vectors in research, new modes of interpretation, but always tempering them with the wisdom of past knowledge. He combines unparalleled knowledge of Polish history and literature, profound empathy for the Polish experience, and a sharp critical perspective. He stands at the intersections of our field, between Poland and the West, between conventional scholarship and new directions, between scholars, patrons, politicians, students, and the public, between research and its dissemination. He is the master interpreter, both in the sense of interpreting Polish history and literature, and interpreting the sensibilities of various constituencies to one another. Poles to outsiders, scholars to politicians and patrons, specialists to non-specialists, publishers to writers, etc., etc., unquote. In mentioning patrons, Moshe touches here on something I alluded to myself that is too often forgotten: Antony's skill in finding patrons to provide financial support. Littman bears the costs of publishing Polin once the text is submitted, but year by year, Antony has raised the money needed for translation, indexing, and other aspects of publishing that the author is contractually required to cover. That is no small achievement, and I'd like to thank the people who have supported him in this. Professor Shaul Stampfer whose book on the Lithuanian yeshivas that we published some time ago has become a classic, offers a very measured perspective and some rabbinical insights. Quote, I like Antony very much. There are a fair number of rather talented scholars floating around, but there are very few who are as concerned as Antony is with the advancement of others. Antony has made some truly major contributions, but his true impact on the field is all of the students and acquaintances who he has helped to learn more and to develop. As the rabbis said, Gadol ha'ma'aseh mi'ha'oseh. One who stimulates others to achieve is greater than a person who only does that himself or herself. The reason is clear. What one person can possibly do is quite finite. But if one puts aside some of one's own work and takes the time and makes the effort to stimulate others, and they, or at least some of them, in turn stimulate yet others, the impact and consequences are immeasurably greater than what one could ever achieve alone. Thus, if one takes into account Antony's impact on the field of Polish Jewish studies and all of the ancillary fields that he's touched, it's hard to believe that he's only 80 years old. Indeed, perhaps that's the secret of his youthful appearance. By giving so much, he hasn't really had time to get old. I look forward to many more years of his giving and achieving, unquote. Now, these last few tributes have all come from American-born scholars. But the two final tributes both come from Polish scholars. First, Marek Tuszewicki of Kraków, whose book on Jewish folk medicine in Eastern Europe, A Frog Under the Tongue, we published only last week. This is what he had to say, quote, it is difficult to overestimate Professor Polonsky's contribution in the development of Jewish studies, especially from the perspective of Eastern Europe. His enormous authority, ability to conduct dialogue, and deep humanism were the guideposts thanks to which research on the history of culture of Jews in our region has developed significantly over the last 30 years. Without his kind support, many initiatives in this area would not have been successful. International conferences, summer schools, new research centers could always count on the optimism of Professor Polonsky, who helped build bridges and find sources of funding, as well as encouraging the implementation of the most daring plans. If I were to compare Professor Polonsky to anyone, I would say he represents a similar cultural type to Václav Havel or Czesław Miłosz, although as a historian, he reads the past in a more rational way. It is good to know that this generation of humanists is still with us, unquote. Note again the emphasis on Antony's authority and his ability to conduct dialogue and deep humanism, and indeed his optimism and his ability to find sources of support as significant factors in the development of Jewish studies in Poland over the last 30 years. And finally, Professor Marcin Vozinski, who has published 2 monographs with us and recently co-edited volume 33 of Polin. Quote, Antony is maybe the last scholar in our subfield who reads everything. This in itself is not as surprising as the fact that he also remembers everything he has ever read. And on top of this, he integrates it into a historical narrative that is up to date with the current state of research globally, compelling and integral. This is possibly best evidenced in his own 3 volumes, but it was also his policy with Polin. Moreover, in publishing Polin, Antony combined his 2 strengths, scholarly and managerial. I don't know about the financial background of the enterprise, but the fact that Polin has provided a unique platform where East European, mostly Polish scholars could have their articles translated and published in a prestigious venue, accompanied by all the Gedolei Israel of Polish Jewish studies, and then meticulously edited. This was a real miracle and maybe the most important factor in the successful integration of Polish Jewish studies in Poland and abroad. And last but not least, he continues, Antony is the only person I know who can talk to everybody, not a small thing, unquote. So thank you, friends, for listening. Thank you to all the people who have contributed their tributes to my presentation. Thank you to Louis Littman for having established the Littman Library, and to Colette Littman for continuing it after his death, and particularly for agreeing to bear the financial cost of publishing Polin, an enterprise that would have been close to Louis's heart because his own family came from Warsaw. Finally, thank you to Antony for being you, and to Arlene, always at his side and always supportive to him in everything. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Connie. Thank you so much. And I think we all will take a lot from your appreciation and tribute to Antony. And perhaps, Antony, you would like to say a brief vote of thanks.
It's very difficult to respond to this extremely generous and very warm tribute. It's been a great privilege to work with Connie and Jonathan. Without Connie, Polin would never have survived. It's always been possible to discuss all of the difficult issues which we faced in producing this very important yearbook. I'm humbled by what people have said about me. I hope that even 1/10 of it is actually true. But I hope that I have contributed in some way, and I'm very grateful to all of those who spoke so warmly, and to everybody else with whom I've worked. One of the things that I've always felt in editing Polin is that it's like a continual party. It's wonderful to have so many wonderful associates from whom one can always learn. Insofar as my 3-volume History of the Jews in Poland and Russia has any worth, it is above all because of what I learned from the people who contributed to the 25 or 26 volumes of Polin which had appeared when I was working on it. And indeed, one of the principles on which I always operated was to try and commission both articles and volumes on subjects about which I myself was curious but didn't actually know that much. And I always found that what people produced was enormously helpful. And I hope that Francois and I will be able to continue this important project for many years to come. But above all, let me thank Connie for this most generous tribute, which I very much hope I deserve.
Thank you, Antony, and thank you again, Connie. I hand back to Christine to close the first part of our proceedings.
Thanks, Francois. And as Connie mentioned, we will have, during the lunch break, if you decide to come back in or sort of leave your screen on, we'll have a short PowerPoint presentation of all of the titles, so you can have a look back on those. It's now time actually for our lunch break. Unfortunately, if this were in person, we would have offered it to you, but we have to leave it to you to take care of your lunches yourselves. We will be back in session at 1:15 for our second panel on memory, which will be chaired by Michael Fleming. So you can use the same link, so please come back in the same link that you've had. And we look forward to welcoming you back after the lunch break. And thank you again for your participation and your excellent questions this morning.
Okay.